Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Grandma saved a dead ice dragon. Then it whispered the unthinkable. The wind howled through the empty expanse, carrying with it shards of ice and snow that bit into Jonah's weathered face. He pulled his thick coat tighter around his shoulders, muttering under his breath as he trudged through the frozen wilderness. His old bones weren't made for this kind of cold anymore, but habits were hard to break. For 40 years he had walked these paths, tending to the imperial botanical gardens nestled between the ice cliffs, ensuring that what little greenery remained in this frozen world continued to thrive. But the Empire had long since abandoned this place, leaving Jonah behind with nothing but his quiet routine and the whisper of the wind for company. He didn't mind, solitude suited him just fine. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way toward the eastern ridge, where the last remnants of the solar dome still stood. Most had collapsed years ago, their once glorious glass structures shattered by relentless storms. Jonah had spent years salvaging what he could, keeping what plants remained alive in the underground greenhouse. It was the only warmth in this icy wasteland, a tiny defiance against the Empire's neglect. But today something was different. Jonah felt it before he saw it, a heavy stillness in the air, a weight that pressed against his senses, stirring a long-dormant instinct in the back of his mind. He slowed his steps, eyes narrowing against the thick mist curling along the ice field. Something big was out there. Then, through the haze, he saw it, a massive form, half buried beneath the snow, its enormous body twisted and still. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. At first he thought it was just another broken remnant of the Empire's past, a downed warship, perhaps, or some long-forgotten war machine, but as the wind shifted, revealing more of the creature's frozen body, Jonah realized the truth. It wasn't metal, it was alive, a dragon. Jonah stared, barely able to comprehend what he was seeing. The creature's massive wings were wrapped tightly around its body, as if trying to shield itself from the relentless cold. Its scales, a deep sapphire hue, shimmered faintly beneath a thick layer of frost, its long tail was curled around itself, trapped beneath ice, and its enormous head rested against the snow, unmoving. The Empire had once bred dragons for war, creatures of fire and destruction used to lay waste to entire planets, but those days were long gone. The program had been dismantled, the creatures hunted, destroyed, erased, and yet here one lay abandoned and dying. Jonah hesitated, every rational part of his mind screaming at him to turn back, to leave it, to let nature take its course. But then the dragon's eyes flickered open, a piercing green glow, dull with exhaustion but still aware. Jonah let out a slow breath. Hell, he muttered, rubbing a gloved hand over his face, guess I don't have a choice now. Jonah moved quickly, years of experience guiding his hands even as his mind struggled to process what he was doing. He had spent his life tending to fragile ecosystems, reviving plants that others had abandoned. This was no different, just bigger, much bigger. He knelt beside the dragon's head, reaching out hesitantly. His fingers brushed against its frozen scales, and even through the thick gloves he could feel how unnaturally cold it was. The dragon was dying, its body shutting down, its fire extinguished by the relentless cold. Jonah had seen animals caught in the ice before, he knew what happened when the cold crept too deep, when the body could no longer fight to stay alive. But this dragon was still breathing, that meant there was still time. All right, big guy, Jonah muttered, pushing himself to his feet. Let's see what we can do. His shack wasn't far, just beyond the next ridge, but there was no way he could move the dragon on his own, even if he had a working transport, a luxury he hadn't had in years. It wouldn't be enough. No, he had to work with what he had. Jonah unfastened his coat, yanking free the heating packs he always kept tucked inside. They were small, designed to keep his hands warm during long hours outside, but they would have to do. He cracked them open, pressing them against the dragon's body, one against its chest, another near its neck, where he guessed the blood flow would be strongest. The dragon let out a weak, shuddering exhale, its nostrils flaring as the warmth seeped in. That's it, Jonah said, his voice steady. Stay with me. Next, he pulled out his emergency thermal blanket, unfolding it as best he could before draping it over the dragon's snout. It wasn't merely enough to cover the entire creature, but it was something. The storm was closing in fast, the wind picking up, carrying the promise of another brutal night. He needed to get the dragon out of the open. Jonah scanned the landscape, his mind racing. There, a narrow cave carved into the side of the ridge, half hidden by a cluster of frost-covered boulders. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He turned back to the dragon, his stomach twisting. It needs to move, he murmured. Jonah reached out, placing a firm hand against its scaled cheek. Listen, he said in a low voice, you want to live, you've got to help me. The dragon's eyes flickered again, meeting his gaze for a moment. Nothing happened. Then, with a slow, agonizing effort, the dragon shifted its limbs. It trembled as it tried to move, ice cracking along its body as it pulled itself free from the frozen ground. Its wings twitched, sending a small avalanche of snow cascading down its back. Jonah stepped back, giving it space. He could see the strain in the dragon's movements, the way it fought against its own failing strength. Come on, he urged, motioning toward the cave. The dragon let out a weak growl, but it obeyed. It took one staggering step, then another, its claws sinking into the snow. Jonah walked beside it, guiding it forward, ready to catch it if it collapsed, not that he could do much against something so massive. But still, by the time they reached the cave, the dragon was barely holding itself up. Jonah guided it inside, where the wind couldn't reach them, where the walls would help trap what little heat they had. The dragon collapsed onto the stone floor with a deep, shuddering breath. Jonah crouched beside it, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Well, he said, leaning back against the cave wall, that was the stupidest thing I've done in a long time. The dragon let out a slow exhale, its emerald eyes half-lit but still watching him. Jonah smirked. Yeah, you're welcome. The storm howled outside, but inside, for the first time in a long while, Jonah didn't feel alone. The cave was cold, but at least it wasn't as exposed as the frozen plains outside. Jonah sat on the rough stone floor, his back pressed against the wall, watching the dragon's slow, shallow breathing. It wasn't out of danger yet. Sapphire, as Jonah had decided to name it, was still half frozen. The sapphire-colored scales barely reflected the dim light inside the cave, dulled by ice and exhaustion. The beast's wings were curled tight against its body, the membrane stiff from the cold. It had taken every ounce of strength just to make it inside. Jonah rubbed his hands together, blowing into them for warmth. He wasn't in much better shape, the hike through the storm had drained him, and now he was stuck here, sharing a cave with a half-dead dragon. He had done stupid things in his life, but this was shaping up to be one of the worst. Sapphire let out a low, rumbling exhale, the sound barely audible over the wind howling outside. Jonah watched as the dragon's nostrils flared, taking in the scent of the cave. Its emerald eyes flickered open just a fraction. It wasn't unconscious, but it was weak, far too weak to move again anytime soon. Jonah needed to act fast. He pushed himself up, shaking the stiffness from his limbs. His shack wasn't far, but he couldn't leave Sapphire alone. If the dragon passed out again, it might not wake up. If another storm rolled through, the cold might claim it before he got back. He grabbed his pack, rifling through what little supplies he had left, a single emergency heat pack, some rations, a spare insulated blanket, not nearly enough. Jonah sighed, glancing at the dragon. Looks like we're making do with what we've got. He unwrapped the heat pack, activating it with a sharp press before tucking it into the thickest part of Sapphire's scales, just beneath the curve of its jaw, where the warmth might reach its core faster. The dragon flinched slightly at the contact but didn't resist. Good, Jonah muttered, means you can still feel something. He reached for the blanket, hesitating for only a moment before draping it over the dragon's massive snout. The gesture felt ridiculous, like putting a child's coat on a starship, but it was the best he could do. Then he did something even more reckless. He sat down beside the dragon, pressing his own body against its frozen scales. The heat exchange wasn't much, but it was something he could feel, the faint tremors in Saphir's body, the slow, unsteady rise and fall of its chest. The dragon needed warmth, and right now, Jonah was the only heat source available. "Don't get used to this," Jonah grumbled, shifting to get more comfortable. "I didn't survive all these years just to freeze to death in a cave because of some stubborn dragon." Saphir let out a soft huff. Jonah chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's what I thought." The storm outside raged on, but inside the cave, for the first time in a long time, Jonah didn't feel like he was just waiting out another long winter. This time, he was fighting against it. By the time the storm began to ease, Saphir had stopped shivering. Jonah could feel it in the way the dragon's body had shifted, the deep, slow breaths were no longer ragged and uneven. The heat packs had done their job, and the body warmth they had shared had kept the beast from slipping further toward death. But Saphir was still weak. Jonah shifted, pushing himself up from the stone floor, his limbs were stiff and his fingers were numb, but he was alive, and, more importantly, so was Saphir. The dragon stirred slightly, lifting its head just a fraction before letting it fall back onto the cave floor. Its emerald eyes cracked open, watching him through half-lit exhaustion. Jonah let out a slow breath. Morning sunshine, Saphir made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a growl. Jonah chuckled. "Yeah, I feel the same way." He moved carefully, stretching his legs before making his way toward the cave entrance. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in thick snow. The landscape was unrecognizable, the wind having reshaped the drifts overnight, burying the trail he had used to get here. Jonah scowled. That was going to be a problem. He turned back to Saphir, watching as the dragon slowly tried to move again. It shifted its wings slightly, testing them before wincing at the stiffness. The limbs hadn't fully recovered yet. "You're not flying out of here anytime soon," Jonah muttered, stepping closer. "And I'm not carrying you, so we're going to have to take this slow." Saphir blinked at him, then exhaled a small puff of steam. It wasn't fire, not yet, but it was a sign that the dragon's inner heat was returning. Jonah nodded to himself. "All right, we'll get you moving again." He reached into his pack, pulling out the last of his rations. It wasn't much, just a handful of dried meat and protein bars, but it was better than nothing. He tossed a piece toward Saphir, who sniffed it cautiously before flicking it away with a claw. Jonah rolled his eyes. "Picky, are we?" The dragon huffed, shifting slightly before lowering its head again. Jonah sighed, breaking off another piece of the rations before stepping closer. "Come on," he said, offering it directly, "you need food." Saphir eyed him for a long moment before, with slow deliberation, it extended its tongue and took the food from his hand. Jonah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't just that the dragon had accepted food, it was that it had trusted him enough to take it. Jonah sat back, watching as Saphir chewed slowly. "All right," he muttered, stretching his legs one step at a time. "I guess." Saphir didn't answer, but as the dragon slowly shifted its wings again, the first hints of strength returning to its movements, Jonah knew one thing for certain: they weren't just waiting out the cold anymore, they were beating it together. Jonah was never one for patience. He had spent his whole life tending to things that grew, slow gardens, trees, ecosystems that took years to flourish, but waiting for a half-frozen dragon to recover in a cave while the Empire's shadow loomed over the horizon tested a level of patience he didn't have. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, quiet stillness in the frozen valley outside the cave. The landscape was transformed, snowdrifts piled high, the distant ridges now barely recognizable beneath their thick white coat. The world had reset itself in the wake of the storm. But inside the cave, the battle against the cold still wasn't over. Saphir was alive, that was the good news. The dragon had stopped shivering, and its eyes were no longer clouded with exhaustion. The heat Jonah had provided had worked, but there was still something off, the dragon was still too weak to stand. Jonah crouched beside the massive creature, studying its movements carefully. Saphir's muscles trembled when it tried to lift its weight, its wings twitched with the attempt before sagging against the stone floor. "You're going to have to help yourself at some point, you know," Jonah muttered, standing up and dusting the snow off his coat. "I can't carry you." Saphir exhaled steam, curling from its nostrils, the closest thing to a reply it could muster. Jonah let out a slow breath, stepping toward the cave entrance. He needed supplies, more food, proper heat sources, and something to help Saphir get moving again. His shack wasn't far, but leaving the dragon alone made him uneasy. The last thing he needed was for scavengers or, worse, Imperial scouts to find it before he got back. He glanced back at the dragon. "You gonna be all right if I step out for a bit?" Saphir blinked at him slowly. Jonah shook his head, pulling his coat tighter. "I'll take that as a yes." He stepped out into the snow, squinting against the brightness of the post-storm morning. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of frozen pine and untouched wilderness. He had walked this path hundreds of times before, but today felt different. His shack was a little over a mile away, nestled in a thicket of trees where the Empire's eyes rarely wandered. He moved quickly, sticking to the natural paths where the snow wasn't as deep, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. If the Empire had sent patrols out after the storm, he needed to know now. By the time he reached the shack, his hands were numb from the cold and his breath was coming in short bursts. He pushed the door open, stepping into the familiar warmth of his home, if he could even call it that. The place was small, built more for function than comfort, filled with tools, ration supplies, and remnants of the life he had lived before the Empire had abandoned this land. Jonah grabbed what he needed, extra blankets, dried meat, and the last of the emergency heating rods he had stashed away. He didn't know how much longer he could stretch his supplies, but that was a problem for later. Right now, getting Saphir back on its feet was the priority. With his pack full, Jonah headed back toward the cave, his instincts sharp, his senses on high alert. He had spent too many years alone to ignore the feeling creeping up his spine, the certainty that something was watching him. As he climbed the last ridge, his heart nearly stopped. Footprints, fresh ones, leading toward the cave. Jonah swore under his breath and broke into a sprint. He moved fast, his boots crunching against the snow, his pulse hammering in his ears. The tracks weren't his, and they weren't natural, they were uniform, too precise, too measured, Imperial scouts. He reached the cave entrance, slowing his steps, pressing his back against the rock wall as he listened. Inside, the soft crackle of embers from the fire pit was still there, but now there was something else, a voice. Jonah clenched his jaw. "Fascinating," the voice murmured low and calculating, "you're not as dead as they thought." Jonah eased forward, peering into the cave. A figure stood near Saphir, clad in black Imperial armor, the kind worn by the Empire's elite field operatives. He wasn't just some low-ranking grunt, his posture was too relaxed, his presence too assured. This wasn't a soldier on a rough team patrol, this was a hunter. Jonah stepped further inside, his fingers tightening around the knife at his belt. He wasn't much for violence, but if it came down to it, he wasn't about to let the Empire reclaim what it had thrown away. Saphir was watching the man, its emerald eyes narrowed, but it hadn't moved, still too weak. The Imperial hunter turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward Jonah without a hint of surprise. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the hunter said. "Jonah," he gritted his teeth, "if you were looking for a warm welcome, you came to the wrong place." The man smirked, taking a slow step toward him. "Do you even realize what you found? This creature," he motioned to the dragon, "was supposed to be dead. The Empire purged them all years ago, and yet here it is, alive." Jonah forced himself to stay calm. "Looks dead to me," he replied. The hunter chuckled. "You're a terrible liar." Jonah shifted his stance, readying himself. "That thing's not yours to take." The hunter tilted his head, amused. "Oh, and I suppose it belongs to you now?" Jonah didn't answer. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. If this man left here alive, the Empire would return in force. Sapphire let out a deep, rumbling growl, shifting its body slightly. It was subtle, but Jonah saw it. The dragon was regaining its strength. Not enough to fight yet, but soon. The hunter seemed to sense it too. He glanced back at Sapphire, then at Jonah, a flicker of calculation in his eyes. "Tell me," he said smoothly, "how long do you think you can protect it?" Jonah's jaw tightened. The hunter smirked. "That's what I thought." Then, with a swift, practiced motion, he reached for his sidearm. Jonah moved. He lunged forward, grabbing the hunter's wrist before he could fully draw the weapon, twisting with every ounce of strength left in his aging body. The hunter grunted, staggering back, but he was quick, too quick. He kicked Jonah's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain shot up Jonah's spine, but he rolled, scrambling back to his feet just as the hunter leveled his blaster at him. Then, a roar filled the cave. Sapphire's wings snapped open, the sheer force of it sending a gust of air that knocked the hunter off balance. Jonah took his chance, lunging forward again and slamming his shoulder into the man's chest. They hit the ground hard, and Jonah wrenched the blaster from his grip, tossing it across the cave. The hunter gasped, dazed, but his eyes flicked toward Sapphire. The dragon was no longer just watching, it was rising. Jonah stepped back as Sapphire pushed itself up onto shaking legs, its emerald eyes burning with fury. The hunter's bravado faltered for the first time. "I think we're done here," Jonah exhaled. The hunter scrambled back, knowing he had lost. Without another word, he bolted toward the cave entrance, disappearing into the snow. Sapphire let out a heavy breath, sagging slightly but still standing. Jonah clapped a hand against its side, grinning. "About damn time." Sapphire snorted, steam curling from its nostrils. The fight wasn't over, but now, for the first time, they were ready for it. The hunter was gone, but his presence lingered like a specter in the cave. Jonah stood in the dim, for light, watching the entrance long after the man had disappeared into the frozen wilderness. The reality of their situation weighed heavily on him now. There was no more hiding. The Empire would come, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Sapphire shifted beside him, its wings still trembling from exertion. The dragon had managed to stand, but Jonah could tell the effort had cost him. His limbs were stiff, his breath still uneven. He had regained strength, but he wasn't ready to fight off an army. Jonah turned, meeting the dragon's gaze. "We don't have much time," he said. Sapphire blinked slowly. "We have to get you moving," Jonah continued, rubbing the back of his neck. "And I mean really moving. If the Empire sends a squad after that bastard, we won't stand a chance, unless you can fly." Sapphire huffed a small puff of steam curling from its nostrils. Jonah studied him for a moment. "Can you still breathe fire?" The dragon's expression was unreadable, but after a long pause, it parted its jaws slightly and exhaled a faint wisp of heat, a flicker out, weak, barely enough to warm the cave air. Jonah frowned. "That's not going to scare off an Imperial gunship." Sapphire growled, shaking his wings. "Jonah," he said as he paced, the dragon was still recovering, but there had to be a way to speed it up. He knew nothing about dragon physiology, but he knew how fire worked. It needed fuel, energy, a source to burn food. Jonah's eyes flicked toward his pack. He didn't have much left, but it was worth a shot. He pulled out the last strips of dried meat and tossed them toward the dragon. Sapphire barely glanced at them. "Come on," Jonah muttered. "You're not going to get better by starving yourself." Sapphire snorted, but after a moment of hesitation, reached down and took the food. He chewed slowly, his expression thoughtful. Jonah watched him closely. The dragon still seemed sluggish, like he was waiting for something to click back into place. Maybe food wasn't enough, maybe he needed heat. Jonah frowned. "The cold had nearly killed you, maybe it did more damage than I thought. The Empire bred these creatures for war, but they are still living things, and living things, when frozen to the bone, don't just bounce back." Jonah stepped closer. "What do you need?" he murmured, mostly to himself. "What's missing?" Sapphire shifted his claws, scraping against the stone floor, then suddenly his head snapped toward the entrance. Jonah tensed. "What is it?" The dragon inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring, his wings tightening against his body, his entire frame tensing like a coiled spring. Jonah turned toward the entrance, and then he heard it, the distant whine of engines. "They are coming." Jonah's pulse pounded in his ears, the low hum of Imperial thrusters was unmistakable, a sound that sent a chill deeper into his bones than the cold ever could. He had spent years beneath their shadow, learning to recognize the specific pitch of their ships, small craft scouts, but they were fast, and worse, they were early. Jonah's mind raced. He had expected more time, days, maybe even a week, before the Empire sent a force strong enough to take Sapphire down, but the hunter must have reported in immediately. "Damn it," Jonah muttered, grabbing his pack. Sapphire let out a low growl, his head lowering slightly, emerald eyes flicking toward the entrance of the cave. Jonah didn't need to speak, dragon to know exactly what that look meant. "We are not ready." Jonah turned to face him. "I know, but we don't have a choice." The dragon hesitated. Jonah could see the battle happening behind those piercing eyes, the desire to fight against the fear that his body wouldn't be able to keep up. Jonah took a step forward. "Listen to me, you were built for this. The Empire made you into a weapon, but they never expected you to have a mind of your own, they never expected you to fight for yourself." Sapphire exhaled sharply, the heat in his breath slightly stronger than before. Jonah nodded. "You're going to have to fly." The dragon shifted its weight, claws flexing against the stone. He tried extending his wings fully, but a tremor ran through them. Jonah saw the hesitation, the doubt. He reached out, pressing a firm hand against Sapphire's scaled chest. "You can do this." Sapphire stared at him, the sound of engines grew louder. Then something changed. Jonah saw it happen in real time, the dragon's hesitation vanished, replaced by something colder, more resolved. His emerald eyes sharpened, his wings stretched further. He took a deep, slow inhale, filling his lungs completely. Then, with a sudden, violent force, Sapphire roared. It wasn't weak this time, it wasn't some feeble attempt at fire. The dragon's mouth opened wide, and a wave of searing blue flames erupted from his throat, roaring into the cave air like a sun igniting in the dark. Jonah felt the heat instantly, warmth rushing through the chamber, melting the icicles that had formed along the ceiling. The fire swirled, growing hotter, wilder. This wasn't just survival, this was power. Jonah grinned. "There you are." Sapphire exhaled again, this time with purpose, and more fire followed. It wasn't perfect, his body was still shaking, his energy not yet fully restored, but it was enough. Outside, the first scout ship crested the ridge. Jonah turned, watching as the sleek, black craft hovered above the snow, its engines kicking up thick clouds of frost. The side door slid open, revealing the first wave of Imperial soldiers, their weapons already aimed. Jonah set his jaw. "All right, guy," he muttered, stepping back toward the dragon. "You remember how to do this?" Sapphire's wings flexed, his tail twitched, his emerald eyes gleamed. Then, without another second of hesitation, the dragon moved. Jonah barely had time to grab onto one of the thick ridges along Sapphire's back before the beast launched himself forward. His wings snapped downward, kicking up a whirlwind of snow as his body surged toward the cave entrance. The soldiers barely had time to react before a storm of blue fire engulfed them. Jonah held on tight as Sapphire crashed through the cave's entrance, his wings fully extending in the open air. The cold wind hit them both hard, but Sapphire didn't falter, he was moving on pure instinct now, muscle memory taking over. The first scout ship veered to the side, its pilot trying to avoid the blast of flames. Jonah could hear frantic shouts over the comms, the panicked orders. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not this kind of resistance. Sapphire beat his wings again, and then they were airborne. Jonah clung tightly to the dragon's back as they rose higher, the ground shrinking below them. He had never flown before, never thought he would, but here he was, soaring above the frozen wasteland on the back of something the Empire had tried to erase. The soldiers below scattered, firing wildly into the sky, but they were too slow. Saphir let out another deafening roar, his wings cutting through the air, and for the first time since their fates had become entwined, Jonah knew one undeniable truth: this wasn't just survival, this was war. The wind howled around them as Saphir cut through the sky, his wings beating with newfound strength. Below, the snowy wasteland stretched endlessly, broken only by jagged ridges and deep valleys. Jonah clung to the dragon's back, his fingers gripping the ridges of Saphir's scales as they soared higher. The cold air stung his face, but he didn't care. They were alive, they had escaped the cave, but they weren't safe yet. The Empire scouts hadn't given up. The first ship had barely avoided Saphir's blast of fire, but two more were closing in fast, their sleek, black hulls reflecting the dim light of the winter sun. Jonah turned his head just in time to see a flash of blue as one of the ships fired an energy bolt straight at them. "Saphir, move!" Jonah shouted. The dragon reacted instantly, tilting his body sideways and diving. The bolt streaked past them, missing by inches. Jonah's stomach lurched as they dropped, the sheer force pressing him hard against Saphir's back. Below them, the ground came rushing up for a terrifying moment. Jonah thought they wouldn't pull up in time, that they would crash straight into the frozen landscape. But at the last second, Saphir spread his wings wide, catching the air and leveling out. Snow erupted beneath them in a massive wave as they skimmed just above the surface. Jonah barely had time to catch his breath before another shot fired from behind. This time, Saphir didn't dodge. Instead, the dragon twisted midair, turning his massive head toward the incoming blast. His mouth opened wide, and with a deep, guttural growl, he countered with a stream of pure blue fire. The two forces met in midair, plasma and dragonfire colliding in a blinding explosion. The shock wave sent them spinning. Jonah gritted his teeth, his arms tightening around Saphir's neck as they fought to regain control. The dragon flapped his wings furiously, pushing them higher away from the chaos below. Jonah turned his head, scanning the sky. One of the scout ships was veering off, its engines flickering wildly. The explosion had damaged it, but the other ship was still intact, still coming. Then Jonah saw something worse above them. High in the clouds, a massive shadow loomed. A warship. The Empire hadn't just sent scouts, they had sent an entire damn fleet. Jonah's stomach dropped. "Saphir, we need to." Before he could finish, the warship's underside lit up with an eerie red glow. Then, with a deep hum, it fired a massive energy net shot toward them, designed not to kill but to capture. Saphir roared, twisting hard, but the net was too big, too fast. It slammed into them with brutal force. Jonah felt the impact like a punch to the chest. The net crackled with energy, wrapping around Saphir's wings and locking them in place. The dragon let out a furious snarl, struggling, but the more he fought, the tighter the net constricted. Jonah's vision blurred as they plummeted. His fingers burned where they touched the energy web, but he refused to let go. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the ground rushing up to meet them. Jonah awoke to the sound of distant, muffled voices. His head ached, and his entire body felt like it had been crushed under a landslide. He blinked hard, his vision slowly coming into focus: cold metal walls, harsh overhead lighting, a cell he was inside on an Imperial warship. His arms were bound behind his back, his wrists locked in thick metal cuffs. He tried to shift, but a sharp jolt of electricity shot through his body, forcing him still. "Don't struggle," a voice said. Jonah turned his head. Standing just outside the cell was the hunter, the same one from the cave. His black armor gleamed under the artificial light, and his expression was, almost amused. "You should be dead," the hunter said. "Most people don't survive falling from that height." Jonah grunted. "Guess I'm lucky." The hunter tilted his head. "Not luck, the dragon caught you." Jonah's breath hitched. Where is he? The hunter smirked. Oh, don't worry, he's still alive, for now. Jonah clenched his fists. If you've hurt him. The hunter held up a hand. Relax, old man, we need him alive. Do you have any idea how valuable a living war dragon is? Jonah didn't answer. The hunter continued, stepping closer to the cell door. The Empire thought they were extinct. They made sure of it, and yet here you are, flying around with one like he's your personal mount. It's fascinating. Jonah narrowed his eyes. You call hunting down living creatures fascinating? The hunter shrugged. The Empire doesn't like loose ends, he smirked, but I have to admit, I respect what you did, keeping a creature like that hidden all this time. Impressive, but it's over now. Jonah's blood boiled. Let me see him. The hunter's smirk widened. Fine, I think you'll enjoy this part. He pressed a button on the wall, and the metal door at the far end of the corridor slid open. Jonah's heart stopped. Saphir was there, chained to the floor, massive steel restraints clamped around his limbs, locking his wings down. Thick cables ran from his back to the walls, pulsing with an eerie blue energy. The dragon's head was lowered, his emerald eyes dulled by exhaustion. Jonah saw the burns where they had shocked him. He felt a fury unlike anything he had ever known. You bastards, he breathed. The hunter sighed. Come now, don't look so angry. We're giving him a purpose again. The Empire created these creatures for war, and war is what they'll have once we break him. He'll be more powerful than ever. Jonah barely heard him. His mind was already searching for a way out. There had to be something, some weakness, some flaw in their security. Then something changed. Saphir's breathing grew deeper, slower. Jonah saw, at first, the subtle twitch of his tail, the slight movement in his claws. He was watching, waiting, and Jonah suddenly knew with absolute certainty that the dragon wasn't broken yet. The hunter was still talking, but Jonah wasn't listening anymore. Instead, he smiled, a slow, dangerous grin. Because the Empire made one fatal mistake, he thought. They left them together, and when Saphir made his move, I'll be ready. Jonah's wrists burned against the cuffs as he sat motionless, eyes locked on Saphir's chained form. The hunter continued his monologue, pacing leisurely around the bound dragon as if he were inspecting a rare artifact. They thought the dragons were wiped out, the hunter mused, running a gloved hand over the steel harness strapped across Saphir's back. They were too powerful, too unpredictable, but this one survived, and now we have him. Jonah's jaw clenched as he watched Saphir's emerald eyes flicker beneath heavy lids. The dragon was weak, yes, he had been captured, restrained, tortured, but Jonah had seen him on the battlefield. He knew what the Empire didn't, this was not a creature that could be tamed. The hunter crouched beside Saphir's massive head, gripping his snout roughly. The dragon barely reacted, too drained from the energy pulses coursing through the cables and his restraints. That fire of his will come in handy, the hunter continued almost to himself. If we can override his instincts, bend him to the Empire's will, he'll be unstoppable. Imagine him leading our war fleets, entire planets burning at his command. Jonah couldn't listen to this anymore. That's not going to happen, he said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. The hunter turned, arching a brow. Oh, and what are you going to do about it? Jonah smiled slowly and deliberately. Nothing. The hunter frowned. What then? Saphir moved. It was subtle at first, a shift in weight, a flicker of tension in his muscles, then, with a sudden explosive force, the dragon let out a deep, guttural growl, one that shook the very walls of the Imperial warship. The hunter barely had time to react before Saphir's wings snapped open, the metal clamps around them groaning under the pressure. His tail whipped across the floor, sending guards flying as if they were weightless. Jonah used the distraction with a sharp inhale. He yanked his wrists apart as hard as he could. Pain shot up his arms as the cuffs cut into his skin, but then, snap, the restraints broke, the circuits shorting out. The hunter turned back to him, his composure cracking for the first time. Jonah grinned. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Before the man could draw his weapon, Jonah lunged. He tackled the hunter, sending them both crashing to the floor. The impact knocked the blaster from the hunter's grip, and Jonah wasted no time, slamming his fist into the man's jaw. The ship's alarms blared to life, red warning lights flashed across the walls, filling the chamber with an eerie glow. Saphir let out another earth-shaking roar, his fire finally returning as he snapped his jaws at the chains holding him. One by one, they snapped. Jonah barely had time to register what was happening before Saphir moved in an instant. The dragon was free. He launched forward with terrifying speed, his massive claws digging into the steel floor, his emerald eyes burning as he turned his fury on the remaining Imperial forces. Jonah knew what was coming next. Saphir, now the dragon, unleashed hell. A torrent of blue fire erupted from his maw, engulfing the control panels, the walls, the soldiers. The warship shook, sparks flying as the ship's systems overloaded. Jonah could hear the screams of those caught in the flames, the scent of burning metal filling the air. The hunter, dazed and bloody, scrambled backward. "No," Jonah said. "I didn't wait." He grabbed the blaster from the floor and fired. The energy bolt struck the hunter square in the chest, sending him sprawling onto the burning floor. Jonah turned to Saphir, who was already lowering his body. "Time to go." Jonah didn't hesitate. He ran toward the dragon, leaping onto his back just as Saphir spread his wings. Then, with a mighty push, Saphir launched straight through the warship's hull. The cold vacuum of space greeted them as Saphir burst through the warship's outer shell. Metal screamed as it was torn apart, debris spiraling away in the weightless void. Jonah held on tight, his heart hammering as they shot forward, leaving the burning wreckage behind. Below them, the planet stretched out in an endless expanse of white and blue, the icy wilderness they had both called home. Above them, the Empire's fleet hung like a predator waiting to strike, but they were free. Jonah turned his head, scanning for any pursuing ships. The warship behind them was still erupting in flames, its structure buckling. Saphir's fire had done more than just damage it, it had crippled it. The energy surges had spread throughout the entire ship, shutting down its defenses. The Empire wouldn't recover from this. Saphir let out a deep, triumphant growl, his wings cutting through the void with perfect precision. Jonah could feel the strength in every movement, the sheer power that had finally been unleashed. "They aren't anymore," Jonah let out a breathless laugh, gripping onto the ridges of Saphir's back. "Hell of an escape, huh?" Saphir rumbled in agreement. For a long moment, they simply flew, the silence of space wrapped around them, broken only by the distant crackle of dying Imperial transmissions. Jonah could feel the tension slowly drain from his body, the adrenaline fading. They had won, but he knew this wasn't the end. The Empire wouldn't forget, they wouldn't forgive, they would come for them. Jonah exhaled, glancing down at the endless stretch of stars before them. "So," he muttered, half to himself, half to the dragon beneath him, "where do you want to go?" Saphir didn't answer with words, instead, he simply angled his wings, shifting course toward the unknown. Jonah smiled. They were no longer running, they were free.